Welcome to the Harvard Catholic Forum. I'm Deacon Tim O'Donnell, the executive director here, and I'm delighted to welcome you both here at Seaver Hall in Harvard Yard and on the live stream. So let me begin with a brief word about the Harvard Catholic Forum. Our mission is to share the riches of Catholic thought and culture through lectures, non-credit courses, master classes, reading groups, and other programs, both to the university community and to the wider public. Check out our website at harvardcatholicforum.org, where you can sign up for our program announcements, register for future events, and support our important mission by making a financial contribution. All of our programs are free of charge, but none of them is free to put on, so please help us. We depend on your contributions of any size. Tonight's lecture will be archived on the Harvard Catholic Forum YouTube channel. If you like what you see and hear, please share the link to that channel with others. We always have more views on the archive than on day one. Several thank yous are in order. First, to our incomparable program director, Shani Agarwal-Hood, for bringing this all together. And next, our co-sponsors, the Nova Forum at the University of Southern California, the Illuminate Network of Centers for Catholic Thought and Culture, the Harvard-MIT Society of Christian Scientists, and the Harvard Christian Alumni Society. And finally, this event is made possible through the support of the John Templeton Foundation through its grant Illuminate, promoting the Catholic intellectual tradition at campuses nationwide. So let me give you a roadmap of tonight's event. Professor Eire's lecture will last 30 or 40 minutes and will be followed by Dr. FitzGerald's response and some conversation between them. And then we will have an opportunity for some Q&A from the audience. Those of you who are here in person should have received a note card and pencil when you came in. If you have a question, please write it on the card, and after the lecture is over, someone will come by to pick them up, raise your hand to show that you have one. And again, after Dr. FitzGerald's response, some of my colleagues will come up the aisles and collect the cards and bring them to me. I will pass on as many of the questions as I can. Unfortunately, we are unable to take questions from the live stream audience today. And here's something important. Please help us to evaluate and improve our programs by filling out our 2-minute survey after the program today. Everyone who registered in person or on Zoom will get an online survey right after the event. Please open the email and take a couple of minutes to click through. Thank you for your help on this. And finally, right after the lecture, please take the 5-minute stroll down to the Harvard Catholic Center next to St. Paul's Church and join us for a reception, which will be in D. Giovanni Hall. Tonight's lecturer, Carlos Eire, is the T. Lawrison Riggs Professor of History and Religious Studies at Yale. He specializes in the social, intellectual, religious, and cultural history of late medieval and early modern Europe, with a focus on both the Protestant and Catholic Reformations, on the history of popular piety, the history of the supernatural, and the history of death. He is the author of multiple award-winning books, including Reformations, The Early Modern World, The Life of Saint Teresa of Avila, a biography, and most recently, They Flew, A History of the Impossible. His PhD is from Yale. Our responder, Brian FitzGerald, is a lecturer in medieval studies and religion at Harvard. And since we have Yale and Harvard here, we may need to have a halftime celebration. We'll bring out the Yale Bulldog. We'll have the Harvard University Band. So, a scholar of medieval history, Dr. FitzGerald's research interests include the intellectual and religious culture of Europe from the 12th to the 14th century. He received his DPhil from Oxford. So, Professor Eire.
Thank you, Deacon Tim. And thanks to everyone responsible for bringing me here. This is a great pleasure and an honor for me to be here. And I'm also, I want to thank each and every one of you for being here on a Thursday night and on a full moon. So, miracles and the limits of rationality. Yes, another way of phrasing the subtitle of my latest book, History of the Impossible. There are many types of miracles that are considered possible by modern medicine and modern science. As a matter of fact, in canonization processes, to this day, what they try to look for when verifying a miracle, a healing miracle, is to find an atheist physician or an atheist scientist who will say, we have no way of explaining this. But there are miracles that are, in the culture at large, considered absolutely impossible. So I picked two of the most impossible, and that's what I'm going to feature here in this lecture. There is Joseph of Cupertino, 1603 to 1663, flying over the head of the Spanish viceroy and the viceroy's wife, who has just painted. More about Joseph to come. How can one write a history of impossible events? And what are the two that are so impossible? Levitation, something has happened to the formatting in the process. Yeah, the levitatio has levitated above the end. How perfect, how perfect. Levitation, and this might have something to do with the fact that it went through Google Drive. Bilocation, being in two places simultaneously. There you go. Begin with this. It's a fact. It's an absolute fact. Not working? Sure. Is that better? Is it? Okay, great. Yeah, but it's a fact that we have testimonies of humans levitating and bilocating. That's a fact. But our thinking is governed by other types of facts. So I'd like to bring to your attention the fact that there is a tug of war between two kinds of facts at work when we deal with miracles such as levitation and bilocation. First is the social fact, which we get from Emil Durkheim. What is a social fact? Social fact is a way of thinking, a thought, a belief that is so deeply ingrained in culture that most people in that culture don't even think about that as being relative. It's an absolute. And what I tell students in my classes when I get to social facts is just think of language, right? There are bad words. There are words one can't say. That's a social fact. In my lifetime, I'm old enough, I've seen all the wrong words change. All the ones that were wrong when I was growing up are now used very freely, and others have come and taken their place. So it is a social fact in our culture, our dominant culture, that anomalous events, miracles, cannot be ascribed to supernatural causes, because there is no such thing, supernatural cause of anything. And it's also a social fact that humans cannot defy gravity without technology. And the fact that humans cannot be present in two places simultaneously. So therefore, the conclusion is all reports of levitations and bilocations have to be lies. Absolutely. And this goes back to David Hume. More about him in a few minutes. But we also deal with wild facts. Human history up to right now, to today, to 5 p.m. or 5:10 or whatever time it is, there are some anomalous events that defy explanation. And we credit this to William James from Harvard. In his Varieties of Religious Experience and in other of his writings, William James stressed the fact, especially by focusing on individuals who experience mystical ecstasies, that there are wild facts that cannot fit our late 19th, early 20th, early 21st century conceptions of what can happen. Some defy explanation completely. We have thousands of reports of humans hovering or flying. And we have thousands of reports of humans being in two places at the same time. And not just in Western history or in Christianity. All of my colleagues in religious studies who focused on Asian religions, when I told them what my project was, had this response: yeah, of course. What's so special about that? It's a component of many world religions. So Durkheim versus James. But here's the wild fact. Many early modern testimonies, the period I analyze, come from canonization inquests in which nuns, monks, priests, and lay people swear to be telling the truth, knowing that lying under such circumstances would be a mortal sin that could send them to hell forever, or purgatory for a very, very long time. As in a court of law, they swear to tell the truth. So, several reviewers have raised the lie issue with my book. I am passing off lies as facts because absolutely everyone who testified in these canonization inquests had to be lying. And worse than that, I know they're lying. And yet I pretend that they're not lying. So the lie issue is absolute. But I point out, look, testimony, evidence as in a court of law. Can you dismiss the accounts given by people who believe in hell and swear that they're telling the truth, knowing that they might end up in hell? So it puts their testimony on a different level. That's what I like to argue. But then the social fact is that since miracles are absolutely impossible, all the eyewitness must be lying, despite their belief in hell as eternal and real. And those who aren't lying are obviously deluded or mentally ill. St. Augustine had to deal with miracles in his one of his debates with Faustus, the Manichaean. Faustus had accused Augustine and all Christians of making a logical error because God created the laws of nature. If you believe in a God, one God, not like the Manichaeans and two deities, and that God established the rules of nature, the laws of nature, that's a logical fallacy right there. How could he break the laws that he has created? So Augustine replied by saying, it's not improper to say that God does something against nature when it is contrary to what we know of nature. For we give the name nature to the usual and known course of nature. And whatever God does contrary to this, we call prodigies or miracles. So it's our limited knowledge that makes it seem like miracles are going against the laws of nature. And Aquinas picks up on this too. And it could be a long list. I'm just giving you the top two. Aquinas, a miracle is a sensible effect produced by God which transcends all the forces of nature. Doesn't break the laws of nature. Much as Aquinas had to say with grace, which is a supernatural force. Grace does not destroy nature. Grace perfects nature. Same argument for all kinds of miracles and all kinds of supernatural intrusions in the natural world. So a miracle doesn't contradict, destroy, antagonize, or violate the forces of nature. It's an effect which exceeds all the inherent powers of the forces of nature. But in this time period that I'm working on, it's the same time the Protestant Reformation changes everything. And where do we get the social fact that miracles can't happen? Well, it begins with the Protestant Reformation. The theology of all of the first, second, third generation leaders of the Protestant Reformation denied that miracles had taken place in human history after the year 100 or so. Miracles ceased with the death of the last of the apostles. Of course, they couldn't deny miracles had happened, which are recorded in the New Testament. But their argument ran like this. Miracles were necessary to convince people that Jesus was divine. So he gave this power to the apostles. But after enough of a nucleus of converts had been gathered, miracles became unnecessary. And therefore, no miracles. But here's the curious thing. While Protestants rejected much of Catholic theology, and please, a little footnote. When I say Protestants right now, I'm only talking about the first, second, third generation. Things changed later. So first reformers engaged in a life and death struggle with Catholic powers, not just the Catholic Church, but secular rulers who wanted to defend the Catholic Church and wanted to kill them and upend their Reformation. It becomes a polemical issue. The Catholics who took on Luther said repeatedly, this church that you're establishing is the false church because you don't have miracles. Show us your miracles. Luther's argument, and I'll get to him in a minute, and Calvin and Zwingli, you know what? We don't have miracles because they don't happen. However, the devil can fool with nature. So while they reject much of Catholic theology, the Protestant reformers adopt Catholic demonology nearly 100%. So every miracle claimed by the Catholics is demonic. But the cessation of miracles does not last forever in Protestant theology. Yet to this day, there are still some Protestant churches that hold this to be true. Miracles ceased. But it was a polemical weapon, this issue of the cessation of miracles. And here's John Calvin. That the gift of healing was temporary, all are constrained to affirm, and events clearly prove. Then the sign of it ought not to be deemed perpetual. It hence follows that they who at this day set anointing among the sacraments are not the true followers, but the apes of the apostles, except they seek to restore the effect produced by it, which God has taken away from the world for more than 1,400 years. And here's Martin Luther on miracles. Those visible works are simply signs for the ignorant, unbelieving crowd, and for their sakes that are yet to be attracted. But as for us who know already all we do know and believe the gospel, what do we want them for? Notice the ignorant, unbelieving crowd. Already some rationalism creeping in there in the theology. And John Calvin, well, we may also fitly remember that Satan has his miracles. which though they are deceitful tricks rather than true powers, are such a sort as to mislead the simple-minded and untutored. Idolatry has been nourished by wonderful miracles, yet these are not sufficient to sanction the superstition either of magicians or idolaters. And I like to focus on those two last words, magicians and idolaters, because Protestants referred to practically all of Catholic ritual as magic and as suffused with demonic elements. But all the miracles in the Old Testament, Hebrew scriptures, yeah, they happened. All the miracles in the New Testament, yes, they happened, but forget about it. No more. Then along comes the Enlightenment. Yes. And I'll feature just two emblematic figures of the Enlightenment. And actually, if you do a Google search for any Enlightenment thinker, their name and sunglasses, you'll get all kinds of pictures like this. I did not invent this trend. Voltaire. It is impossible that a being infinitely wise can have made laws to violate them. Just like Faustus the Manichaean. Same argument all over again. He could not derange the machine, but with a view of making it work better. But it is evident that God, all wise and omnipotent, originally made this immense machine, the universe, as good and perfect as he was able. If he saw that some imperfections would arise from the nature of the matter, he provided for that in the beginning, and accordingly, he will never change anything in it. And that's from his philosophical dictionary. And David Hume, not only wearing women's glasses, but actually smiling. A miracle is a violation of the laws of nature. The plain consequence is, and it is a general maxim worthy of our attention, that no testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle. I'll pause there. No testimony whatsoever can be true. He sets a very, very, very difficult bar, actually an impossible bar for anyone to clear who sees or reports a miracle. I'll back up. No testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle unless the testimony be of such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the fact which it endeavors to establish. A miracle supported by any human testimony is more properly a subject of derision than of argument. But on the Catholic side, during the 17th century especially, but beginning in the late 16th century, leaders of the Catholic Church streamlined and rationalized the process of canonizing saints. And no one did more than Prospero Lambertini, who became Pope Benedict XIV. And look at his dates. He was Pope from 1740 to 1758, an Enlightenment Pope. What did Lambertini do? He wrote the book, and there it is. It's actually several volumes. He wrote the book that is still used for canonization processes in the Catholic Church with some minor alterations. He writes De Servorum Dei Beatificatione et Beatorum Canonizatione, on the beatification of the servants of God and the canonization of the blessed. Lambertini, good Enlightenment Pope, stresses that heroic virtue is more significant than any miracle, and that therefore anyone who has not displayed heroic virtue, no matter how many miracles that are attributed to them, is not worthy of canonization. So those two are placed together because Lambertini keeps miracles in the canonization process as a very important sign of holiness, which accompanies heroic virtue. And of course, Prospero Lambertini, who actually served as devil's advocate before becoming Pope, whose job, the devil's advocate, I think you probably all know, is the person in the canonization process charged with poking holes in every testimony. There's a wonderful book by Paolo Parigi, I highly recommend it, The Rationalization of Miracles, which covers this story very, very nicely, and from a sociological perspective, but still very solidly historical. Like Augustine and Aquinas, Lambertini, Pope Benedict XIV, argued that miracles are not contrary to the laws of nature, but simply beyond our limited knowledge of eternal laws and the laws of nature. The fault lies with our brains. So where did that cessation of miracles take historiography? Max Weber, in the late 19th and early 20th century, argued that the key feature in the transition to modernity is the Protestant Reformation and its disenchantment of the world. But that's a very poor translation of the word he used in German. Entzauberung, Entzauberung der Welt. Zauber in German is magic. So to disenchant the world is to take all the magic out of it. And Weber pointed to this as the first step towards modern rationalism. And he attributed it to the Protestant reformers. And we're still dealing with this early 21st century. So, of course, throughout the time of struggles with the Protestant Reformation, Catholics continued to believe in all sorts of miracles and are still to this day supposed to believe in all sorts of miracles, including the one that's repeated most often, daily, hourly, around the world, the Eucharist. There are sacramental miracles, and what we have here is one of the most reproduced themes in Renaissance and Baroque art, the miracle of the Mass of St. Gregory the Great, where while consecrating the elements, Christ appeared bodily, and not just Christ, but all the instruments of his passion and death. And that's what you see being depicted here. Protestants, of course, refused to believe that any such thing happened. And while destroying images where this happened, another favorite target were consecrated hosts, which would be thrown in sewers, latrines, or fed to dogs. And in France, the Huguenots called them dieux blancs, white gods. And then there are miracles within mystical visions. So we have here the mystical marriage of St. Catherine of Siena, depicted by a 15th century artist. And mystics are always seeing things that other people don't see and experiencing things that others don't see, which are miraculous gifts. And now this makes us speed towards physical miracles that occur to mystics. Everyone knows about the stigmata, and St. Francis was the first recorded stigmatist. I love this painting by Giovanni Bellini, which hangs in the Frick Gallery in New York, because it is so modern. Yes, no one can see what Francis is seeing, which is how these miracles, these visions appear to those who are not having them. But Bellini made sure to paint tiny little dots on St. Francis's palms to assure us something was happening. So, what about levitation? And here's a test I give all my students. What's wrong with this photo? And no one has gotten it right yet. This levitating saint is a Franciscan, but he's wearing designer shoes. There's basically no levitation in the New Testament. And actually, the term levitation was invented by 19th century spiritualists to give it a scientific aura. They also came up with bilocation, and they also came up with telepathy. All of these are mystical gifts that the spiritualists adopted and gave scientific terminology to them. St. Paul in 2 Corinthians, yeah, the man who went up to heaven, well, no, that doesn't count as a levitation. Early Middle Ages, there are relatively few hagiographies. So therefore, we don't have very many accounts of miracles performed by saints, especially mystics who go into levitation or bilocation. Because here, I'll pause for a second. This is very important. Bilocation and levitation are a side effect of mystical ecstasy. It's not something that any saint can will. It is always a side effect, a physical phenomenon that accompanies mystical ecstasy. And St. Francis, of course, was seen levitating and glowing, but he's not the first. Perhaps the best known medieval levitator is Christina the Astonishing, who went to great heights. But now let's get to the early modern period, St. Ignatius Loyola. There he is levitating and glowing. These two things often go together. And notice he is levitating while kneeling, because this is another fact in every testimony. When a saint begins to levitate, it's when their ecstasy begins and they go into a cataleptic seizure, which means their body becomes rigid. And whatever position they were in, that's how they stay. And they lose all sensation. So we have accounts of levitating saints that are poked with needles. They have candles held up to their eyes, or are blown about the room, which, makes it seem like, no, it's not too serious. No, but it's very serious. More images of Ignatius Loyola levitating. And notice the eyewitness. It's very important. In all representations of levitators, there are always eyewitnesses. Why? Testimony, testimony, testimony. St. Teresa of Avila hated levitating, begged God to stop this. Please, God, why are you doing this to me? Stop it. You're calling attention to me. And you know what happens when attention is called to anyone who is supposed to be humble? Oh, the Inquisition comes around and pokes at the person. So she begged God to stop it, and it stopped sometime in the 1560s. But in letters that she wrote later in the 1570s, she says it came back, including a dual levitation with St. John of the Cross when he was her confessor at the convent of the Incarnation in Avila. And there's another depiction of this event. On Trinity Sunday, they were meditating on the Trinity and talking about the Trinity, and up they went. And actually, it's a version of this painting that started me on this project in 1983. I was visiting the convent. I was at that spot, and the tour guide had shown us other things in the convent, very mundane things like the staircase and the kitchen and the refectory. Oh, and here's the spot where Teresa and John levitated together for the first time. Ooh. Oof. Something happened in my brain. I'll go quickly through these images just so that you see how, and I don't use this term derogatory, to inch down this even 1 millimeter. But it is outrageous. It's outlandish. The levitations ascribed to Joseph Cupertino, no one flew higher in more directions more often than Joseph of Cupertino. But he kept being moved to ever more remote locations by his Franciscan superiors because he attracted so much attention. One of his final stops on this long journey of eventual imprisonment inside a cell is when he saw the Holy House, the shrine of the Holy House of Loreto in northern Italy, where he just, this is represented more often than any other of his levitations. And there you have the image you saw at the beginning, and another one of his levitation at Loreto. On the left, you see him curing a man who was insane. Laid his hand on his head, and up went the man with Joseph. And on the right, he is converting a Lutheran prince, and not any Lutheran prince, Prince of Saxony, and not just Saxony, but the Saxony that Wittenberg is in, who said something like, "Oh, cursed be this land. Everything was fine for me till I set foot here in Italy and saw things like this. Now I can't stay Lutheran." Joseph levitated in public and in private. He levitated over the head of Pope Urban VIII. And Pope Urban supposedly said, "If this man dies before I do, I will testify at his canonization inquest that he flew over my head." And Joseph had triggers, religious imagery, any image that reminded him of Christ, even a lamb could make him go into ecstasy. And he always let out a sound. In Italian hagiographies, there are 3 words used to describe his sounds: grido, shout; strillo; and urlo, sometimes made the buildings shake. So Baroque art gives us many representations of levitating saints. And we have here St. Francis and St. Anthony of Padua, St. Dominic, St. Hugh, and this painting, which hangs in the Louvre Museum, which was stolen by Napoleon and never returned to Spain, of an unknown Franciscan levitating and glowing with plenty of witnesses. And the angels are helping fulfill his vow of obedience because he was in charge of kitchen duty. And in ecstasy, you can't do kitchen stuff. So bilocation, I'll go quickly through this because this is, bilocation always, this is too outrageous for anyone to contemplate. Being in 2 places at once. That's my building. I don't own it. I just have an office. St. Francis, bilocated. No one bilocated more excessively than this Franciscan nun, Maria de Agreda. Same dates as Joseph of Cupertino. If you see that image of her with American natives, it's because without ever leaving Agreda, while in mystical ecstasy and levitating, she crossed the ocean over 500 times to serve as a missionary to the Jumano people in present-day West Texas, where in folklore, anyone here from the Southwest that knows about the Lady in Blue? Supposedly, it's very well-known legend in the Southwest, and not just for religious reasons, but cultural reasons. Maria de Agreda impressed King Philip IV so much that while on his way to the war front, he went out of his way to visit her. And then they established a relationship, wrote 300 letters, or over 300 to each other, where she acted as a kind of non-sacramental confessor to Philip. Does this help explain why she was given a pass by the Inquisition? Yes. Yes, but it may be in the question and answer period. We can get into the details of how much harder it is to establish testimonies of bilocations. It's much harder because, connecting the two places eventually is always very difficult. She also took dictation from the Virgin Mary and wrote the autobiography of the Virgin Mary in many volumes. And the English title is The Mystical City of God. In it, she argues that Mary is co-redemptrix of the human race. But it's basically a fifth gospel of sorts. It contains all sorts of details about Mary's life, Jesus' life, the life of the infant church. And it has an imprimatur, by the way. But her canonization process has stalled. So, to end it, what testimony can we believe about levitation? This one. The first man who went up in a hot air balloon. Jean-François Pilat de Rosier, 1783. Sadly, he died a few other balloons later over the English Channel. So he didn't get to levitate for very long. And then there's the wrong kind of levitation, because Protestants and Catholics both believe that witches levitated. And this is the odd asymmetry of levitation between Catholics and Protestants. Witches can, because the devil is behind it. So the subject gets very sticky. Wrong, but definitely possible, according to Catholics and Protestants. And this will be my last anecdote. I have to tell you about this because it happened here in Boston. The happiest day of my research, I found a case here in Boston, 1693, of a teenage girl possessed by the devil. Cotton Mather and a group of other men, about a half dozen other men, are trying to get rid of the demon. But as part of the process, the girl goes up in her bed. They try to hold her down, they can't. Then they try to jump on top of her so she doesn't do it again, and they can't. And Cotton Mather has all of these men sign affidavits that this, in fact, did happen. And I'm willing to bet Cotton Mather and those men in the room never read the autobiography of Teresa of Avila, where she describes very similar things happening to her. And of course, finally, yes, levitation can be faked. It has been faked many times. But I picked cases like Joseph of Cupertino, where faking the outdoor levitations is beyond the technology available in the 17th century. 19th and 20th century spiritualists also claimed to levitate. And yeah, levitation is absolutely possible. My oldest son spent 2 years in Japan and rode levitating trains. He's my testimony. I know it happens. And then bilocation, well, we do it all the time. But of course, these miracles, these impossible miracles, seem to go not just against the laws of reason, but the laws of nature. And what does one do with them? Belief is a funny thing. And social facts are a very funny thing too. And I think that there is, I'll close with this, because I get asked this question, why doesn't this happen anymore? And I say, no, of course we have testimonies that it does still happen. But I have come to realize that if the social fact is that people believe these things are possible, then we get more instances of them. If the social fact is that these things are impossible, we get much fewer. And I have yet to explain why this is so. I don't think I will ever be able to explain why this is so, but it's just a fact. correlation between social fact and the wild fact. Now, I'll end it there.
Yeah. Great. Thank you. Thank you, Deacon Tim. Thank you, Professor Eire, for this excellent presentation. And of course, thanks to both for offering me the chance to reflect more deeply on this topic and to engage more with the issues raised here. I should say my comments are based on the book itself, and it's in full, not knowing precisely what aspects Professor Eire would speak about tonight, but they will certainly deal with the core of his presentation. You've certainly just received firsthand evidence of the quality of thought behind Professor Eire's work, and the book itself is a terrific example of the ways in which thinking about the past can help us reflect about ourselves in the present. It articulates the often unstated assumptions of our time, and it offers challenges, both explicit and implicit, to the way history is usually presented and practiced, certainly among professional and academic historians, but also it challenges how we think about the past. I don't intend my remarks tonight to be a devil's advocate role. I would like to summarize some of the things that I saw in the book and also raise a few questions that I hope will further our understanding of this topic. So to start off this short period of time I have here, let me read a quotation from the book on its treatment of miracles. "Neither do I wish all the marvels which I have cited to be believed in uncritically, for I myself do not believe in them as if I had no mental reservations regarding them. I believe them only to the extent of judging that their existence is neither to be completely denied nor stoutly maintained." Okay, I lied. Actually, that's not Professor Eire. That's St. Augustine from City of God. So he says essentially things that are quite similar to what Professor Eire says in De Flu, where he proposes that we be, quote, even-handedly skeptical, by which he means suspending, and he likes, it is a pun, yes, suspending both belief and disbelief. Right, that we approach this with an open mind, and that is indeed what Augustine says about the miracles that he describes in the City of God. So I bring in Augustine to highlight two things in particular. One, which we've already had evidence of tonight. Right, this is not a new problem. This is not a new issue that people writing about the past in particular have faced. Even in the so-called Age of Faith, there was room for doubt. And there was certainly plenty of thought that was not purely credulous on all of these events, these forces, these causes that were beyond normal understanding, or perhaps immediately apprehensible. Professor Eire recognizes his work as part of the long debate about the impossible, the miraculous, right? And he shows how a succession of attitudes, including our own, exist, and therefore perhaps suggests that they need challenging or rethinking. And he describes this as perhaps we are entering a new post-secular age, right, in which we reflect on and can historicize our modern assumptions and perhaps see past them. And second, I bring in Augustine to give an exemplar even of an earlier age of writing about these events, because Professor Eire's critique raises questions about what the alternative should look like, right, or what it might look like. And indeed, this is certainly in the response that it has generated among reviews, often a question: what should this look like, right? The discipline of history and history writing has made obviously notable advances in recent centuries in terms of understanding the past. At the same time, it relies on a particular set of assumptions that limit the sorts of questions that we attempt to answer. If we should reconsider, as he says, how or where to draw the line between natural and supernatural, will our descriptions of events come to resemble those of earlier ages, those of the medieval historians, for instance, right, which mix these two realms much more expansively, although not unquestioningly. At the outset of the book, De Flu, Professor Eire criticizes historians who bracket what he calls these wild facts that you'd all just saw. Historians who put aside certain questions about events that we cannot prove, and set them aside precisely because they cannot be proven. Yet immediately after criticizing these historians in this bracketing, as he calls it, right, he acknowledges, quote, the issue of whether so-and-so really flew cannot be addressed. And, quote, no one's testimony from the distant past can be taken as absolute proof. Now, this is an apparent contradiction, but actually not so in the way the book unfolds, because it's a way of distinguishing historical accounts from proof, right? Which is, as he defines it, empirically certain. So despite the explanatory power of science and, let's say, the modern empirical mindset that he described with Voltaire and Hume, Professor Eire resists equating these assumptions with a complete explanation, especially of human experience and particularly of religious experience. To be unable to prove something happened is not a reason to explain it away or ignore it, as he suggests. Hence, he says, we should suspend both belief and disbelief. Right? So agnosticism rather than atheism. But also in that description, not theism either. Agnosticism is at least how the introduction of the book presents it. But we then have this question, what does an agnostic historian do with the impossible? And in this regard, I certainly found Professor Eire's account quite restrained in the book. Right? He engages all the usual historical methods, assessing sources, considering testimony, taking account of numerous explanatory factors. He does not make explicit claims that such, quote, wild facts actually occurred. Yet agnosticism also has its limits. And this occurred to me especially while I was reading this section about witchcraft. Judgments often had to be made about what was most plausible. Not provable, but plausible. And the 16th century physician, which he speaks about, Johann Weyer, for instance, argued that the poor, mentally ill women should cease being persecuted as witches, precisely because they were not, in fact, doing what many alleged that they were doing. It is possible Weyer was wrong, and they were flying. But if he were to rest in that uncertainty and that open-mindedness to witchcraft, it also might have led to less understanding, not more. So judgments had to be made. And the question is, what was plausible? In this case, he chose to consider a natural explanation. The historian also has to make judgments precisely about these kind of assessments, right? To explain that event or that judgment even. Because the historian's narrative also is a judgment about the best way to explain something. Selections of evidence, how to assess things, emphases on particular causes, the arrangement of a narrative. And for the most part, They Flew seeks to expand the range of plausible conclusions a reader might draw. And yet the title of the book is not They Flew, ? But rather They Flew, period. And indeed, the final sentence of the book is actually a declarative, bold statement, They flew, ! So we have a transformation, a typographical transformation from question mark to exclamation mark. And this certainly suggests, in the end, not an agnostic skepticism, not just a neutral open-mindedness, but rather ultimately a judgment about the likelihood that Joseph of Cupertino and Teresa of Avila in particular, though not others, flew. And that question mark becomes an exclamation mark despite the accounts of fraudulent levitators, despite the acknowledgement that Joseph, the historical personage, is, quote, largely inaccessible and irretrievable, according to Professor Eire. More an archetype of sanctity or, quote, a paradigm than a man. Yet there is a slender thread. It is a slender thread for the historian to pull upon if he or she were to seek these impossible causes, impossible events in particular. So I have a question about the typographical change. Right? Is it a judgment that the historian can offer to other historians and other readers of different worldviews and assumptions who might also find ways of assessing it and making sense of it and finding it plausible? In this case, is the historian like the agnostic or atheist doctor at Lourdes, right, who assesses each physical cure to determine whether it might plausibly be the miraculous effect of a transcendent cause? Is that the model which the historian should aspire to? Or is this judgment that turns it into an exclamation mark, is that a judgment that is made only with the eye of faith? A judgment inaccessible because based on a question that cannot be answered by history. And so these questions lead me to one final consideration, and it's one that applies both to historical disciplines and more broadly to our society in this perhaps emerging post-secular age. It's clear that one's worldview determines what one considers plausible, how we determine the evidence and interpret its significance. And this, of course, has long been true of all historical debates, where a Marxist interpretation of history might slug it out with a classical liberal understanding of people's actions. Yet expanding the range of the plausible which historians might now expect to reckon with also means contending with greater disagreements about what is plausible. I heard a talk not long ago by a philosopher who said, even if he were to go outside and see the stars rearrange themselves into the words, God exists, believe in me, he would not take that as evidence for God's existence. Indeed, he would doubt his sanity first, or believe someone had placed something in his coffee. Right? Now, that is a thoroughly consistent naturalistic mindset, which sets an extremely high bar, or as we heard, indeed, an impossible bar for any non-empirical cause to be considered plausible. Such a person would never be persuaded that Joseph of Cupertino flew. So conveying what is plausible to an audience requires a set of common assumptions about the possible meaning of events. And the Historians Guild, professional historians, operates by and large with a shared set of assumptions about what is real and therefore what counts as plausible, as a plausible explanation. So in a perhaps post-secular approach to the discipline of history where that shared consensus is gone, might we expect to see a further fragmenting of shared narratives into a wider variety of perspectives? This question, of course, has resonances with questions about how religious traditions in general find a place within the wider culture. Another historian of the Reformation, Brad Gregory, who is blurbed on the back of the book, has written elsewhere of our hyper-pluralist society, one with numerous religious and secular commitments, but without, quote, any shared or even convergent view about what we think is true or right or good. And the philosopher Alistair MacIntyre has argued that different rationalities, different traditions have their own, often mutually incomprehensible or incompatible narratives. This is not a criticism. He thinks that a tradition requires stories that explain itself to its members and that help those members make judgments about how to live, how to understand the world. So I wonder if Professor Eire would comment in the next section about a little bit on the tension between the assumptions of a particular faith community and its interactions with others in a hyper-pluralist society, or perhaps more personally, the interactions of a believer in the impossible with others in a secular university. In the context of a talk sponsored by the Harvard Catholic Forum, let me put it this way. The price of admission for Christians studying and teaching in secular universities is often to make peace with the assumptions of the modern empirical mind and to adopt a particular way of discussing ideas that is or events that is recognizable to non-Christians. Much good has come from such shared dialogue, but it also comes with limitations. In his epilogue, Professor Eire classifies the Catholic Church's approaches to miracles in its canonization process as one that has indeed made peace with the modern empirical mind. And we saw the example of the Enlightenment Pope. And the canonization process operates generally within rational assumptions while maintaining some space for the miraculous to be discerned. So one question, again, a further question I have, does Professor Eire see his book as a modest proposal for making peace with our secular age while insisting on a little more space for the supernatural? Again, is the doctorate Lourdes the model here? Or is there a more radical proposal underlying the book, akin perhaps to many of the more speculative post-secular approaches which he outlines in his epilogue? The radical approach might be this, in a Christian context. If Christians take seriously the call to open up history writing to impossible events, should Christians develop a new post-secular tradition of history writing, one that takes into account the developments of the critical age, but which firmly moves past it? Would this result in a distinct form of Christian history that resists finding a home in a secular institution? Thank you.
We'll have a last round of questions. Anyone who has one, please raise your hand and it'll be brought up. And that's it for questions.
Okay. I'll wait till the noise subsides. Okay. Are we all set technologically? It's on, it's got the light. Yeah. 1, 2, 3, testing. Yeah, okay. Okay, good. Well, thank you so much for those comments and these questions, because you really hit the bullseye in every sense, because as I have to admit, and I think I do say in the book that this subject raises more questions than the answers it provides. And of course, it raises all sorts of questions. Am I somewhat torn in my attitude towards this evidence? Because I come back to this, I come back to the evidence we have. And one thing that I can say is purely secular. This has nothing to do with my faith, this item. Historians do not throw out hundreds or thousands of testimonies about events. We refrain from doing that. If we have testimonies, we can tell the difference between propaganda, faith, and wild facts. But it's the fact that we have people swearing to tell the truth in these testimonies that convinces me as a historian, and also, of course, as a Catholic, but more so as a historian, that there are wild facts out there that we cannot pigeonhole. And actually, one reviewer compared me to Erasmus of Rotterdam, which I considered a great compliment, but of course the reviewer didn't mean it that way. What the reviewer meant is exactly what Martin Luther said about Erasmus, which is he's as slippery as an eel. You never know what he's really saying, and he toys with you and leaves you wondering what did I just read? And yeah, I think that was my attitude throughout the entire project, is to cast doubt, to raise questions about this methodology of the brackets, that the only thing that historians of religion can talk about is technical term, functionalism. What function does a certain belief or ritual or symbol play? That's all we're allowed to talk about, is the function. So yes, I can talk for hours and hours about the function served, the polemical, just on the polemical level, the polemical function served by the flights of Joseph and Teresa of Avila. Look at us, look what we have that you don't have. Oh, there's no denying the functionalism. Functionalism is a good way of investigating historical events as well as religious events. But I'd like to think, as a historian who was trained to always put my brackets in place, that my entire career I have been chafing. Get rid of the brackets. Because I'm a Catholic? Yeah, I think so. I think so. And have I ever seen anyone levitate? No. Have I ever seen anyone bilocate? No. However, I can say, as a historian and as a Catholic, that I know people, 2 degrees of separation. I know people who claim that they have seen levitation take place, and that the levitators were extremely holy people. Can I write this down and put it as, no, it's not my testimony. It's not my testimony. But the people who told me that they had witnessed this are people I admire. So what does one do with that? But there's also the saying, and I forget to whom it's attributed, God writes with crooked lines. Who is it? Oh, yes, okay. Well, God writes with crooked lines. That's what I think as a Catholic, that as Catholics, we're supposed to believe that there is a supernatural dimension I mean, and it's not just as Catholics, that's the bedrock of all religion, is the belief in another dimension that we cannot comprehend. And occasionally these wild facts pop up. So I am, in a sense, like Erasmus, as slippery as an eel. But I also have great admiration for Erasmus of Rotterdam because of his emphasis on the reality of the spiritual dimension. And he poked fun at pilgrimages and relics. Yes, he did, because there were a lot of abuses. And as you just heard, a good chunk of my book is dedicated to analyzing fakers, frauds. So they're kind of like my control in this experiment. Am I as slippery as an eel? Gosh, I hope not, but just, I know I'm a little slippery because the subject is slippery. And this is not a historian talking. This is a Catholic talking right now. A relic of Padre Pio was making the rounds, and it came to my parish church. And I went, and I thought I would be like one of maybe 12 people. The line was out the door. And it was a contact relic. It was one of his gloves. But seeing that line go out the door and seeing the reverence with which people approached this, it's like eyewitness testimony. I saw this happen. Did I see the glove levitate? No. But I saw something that our culture, our society is odd. It's a wild fact that there was a line out the door. So I'll leave it at that. But thank you for.
Good. Well, thank you. Dr. FitzGerald, you want to make a further comment, question?
No, I think that there are a lot of other questions out there. So.
Okay, good. All right. So, well, maybe we could start with, this puts a couple of these questions together with the distinction between levitation by location in witchcraft and levitation by location by a saint. Is the distinction primarily made by heroic virtue? The question was asked by the practice of agape, for example. Is that really what the distinction is? How do we make that distinction?
Yeah, it's the distinction very clearly is that a certain kind of life has to go along with this phenomena. If the person is not humble, if the person is not self-emptying, service to others, or constant devotion to the sacred, then if they're levitating, it's a problem as far as the Catholic Church is concerned. And this goes before the Council of Trent streamlined and rationalized the canonization process. St. Bernard of Clairvaux, when asked what is the highest virtue, said, humility, humility, and humility. So, and that's an essential component of heroic virtue as defined in this process. The demonic always goes with a completely different kind of behavior. And many of the frauds that I investigate in the book were anything but humble. And that's actually what brought attention to them. Their fraudulent levitations and fraudulent bilocations were ferreted out.
This is really my question, I'll have to say. The evidence is that you deal with the phenomena of levitation and bilocation are very much in the early modern period. You mentioned briefly the medieval period before that there were a few reports of this, much less hagiography done. Can you talk a little bit more about why this was sort of the golden age of these phenomena, do you think?
Yeah, well, actually, very early in the project, I realized that the 16th and 17th century were the peak period for flying in history. I think the religious tensions of the early modern age have a lot to do with these events taking place in a higher number in the 16th and 17th century. The tension between Catholics and Protestants is so immense.
The social fact aspect of it.
Yes.
Yeah.
And as I said, there's no denying the polemical value of holy people who lead virtuous lives. And as a side effect, show you that there is another dimension. Because Saint Teresa, for instance, kept asking, what's the point of these levitations to God? You know, she's very well known for being very feisty and, you know, saying things to God such as, if this is how you treat your friends, no wonder you have so few. Which she supposedly said when she was thrown off, the axle on the carriage broke and she ended up in the mud. But yeah, why are you doing this to me? That to me speaks volumes. Her resistance to this gift was also her fear of the Inquisition.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a very complicated puzzle. The pieces don't always fit together as one would want them to fit together. And like any sort of puzzle that's poorly made, you're left with a few pieces that just don't go into it.
Okay. You mentioned in the beginning of your lecture other religious traditions where these phenomena are known. Did you look into that somewhat? Do you have any thoughts on the level of occurrence in different places and times versus the time that you were studying?
Well, I only sort of glanced at the evidence from other religious traditions. I did not go into it the same depth that I did with this Catholic, very Catholic, not just Christian, but very Catholic phenomenon. But I know for a fact and have known since graduate school that in some Asian religions, especially in Buddhism and in Hinduism, this is considered rather common.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, one of the books that I found and read as I was writing my own was about these flying Tibetan monks. But it's totally unlike the Catholic levitations I was working with, because some of these levitating monks in the Tibetan tradition have consorts, and they engage in sexual intercourse while up in the air.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, oh, that's not the same.
Mm-hmm.
It's just not the same, but it's taken as a fact. And I know in African religions too, not just, you know, like major global religions. Islam had, you know, I always say, where do you think flying carpets come from? I know that in African tribal religions, levitations and bilocations are considered commonplace.
Mm-hmm.
And I know this because of two dissertations I read at the University of Virginia from students who were working in Africa as basically anthropologists. No doubt about it. It's common.
Contemporary example.
Contemporary, yeah. One of these students actually did his dissertation in Liberia,
Mm-hmm.
where the subjects that he was analyzing or studying all called themselves Christians, and not just Christians, they were Baptists. Yet they still maintained this part of their African religion. And here's another twist or difference. I remember that some dissertations stick out in your mind because they point you to something that you didn't think was possible. that sometimes the levitations are of an evil nature, and the bilocations too. And the evil bilocations, people use them to commit crimes and get away with them.
Mm.
So I thought, oh, that's another very different kind.
Mm.
So yeah, I wish I had the time to learn all the languages I would need to study them in the same level I've studied this.
The in the Reformation's period, you have this this split, this intra-Christian split about the question of cessation of miracles. Is there a reflection in that disagreement of the possibility or non-possibility of miracles in other religions, specifically Jews and Muslims, who would have been closest by?
Oh, the Protestants would have, of course, labeled those as demonic in origin.
Oh.
Catholics also would have, if they were reading the standard textbooks on demonology. Yes, anything, any wild fact such as this occurring outside of the Catholic fold is judged to be demonic. And I'm not sure that this has changed since the 17th century.
Mm-hmm.
Because one of the standard questions asked by an exorcist to this day, if someone is experiencing demonic presences or anything of the sort, is whether they have participated in any non-Catholic rituals, such as playing with a Ouija board,
Mm-hmm.
or had their palms read, and so on and so forth. So that still remains. Actually, the best book on this is by Gabriele Amort. An exorcist tells his story.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody interested in what the Catholic Church still thinks, Amort's book is very, very detailed. And I think Luther particularly had a very, very constant exchange with demonic presences, or at least when he was having dinner with his students, and they would take notes on what he said at table. There's a whole series of volumes of Luther's works, the Table Talk. He constantly talked about his struggles with the devil, but of course attributed all Catholic miracles to the devil. My favorite Luther story from the Table Talk is one day he relates he came when he was at the Wartburg Castle, which was very high up on a cliff. He was hiding from the emperor and actually translating the Bible, the New Testament, into German. He came and saw a black dog on his bed that he had never seen before. So he did what any rational person would do. He threw it out the window and then went looking for it to see if he could find it, but at the bottom of the cliff. And there was no dog. So he said, yeah, of course, that was the devil. Yes. Mm-hmm. So it's a shared mentality, right? Because you find similar stories, Catholics of this time period too. The devil was real, very real.
Could I ask one final question? We had the historian Peter Harrison here giving a lecture back in August, and he makes the case based on a very intensive review of the intellectual history of the early modern period in Europe, that the whole idea of the supernatural as distinct from the natural is an invention of European thought at that time. That in medieval thought you do not find it. If you look at the church fathers of the medieval theologians, there is not that distinction, and this is more your field. But how do you react to that? And is that how does that relate to your method?
I disagree that there was no concept of natural and no concept of supernatural. let's say the two concepts gain a different texture as a result of the differences of opinion between Catholics and Protestants in this time period. Yes, they acquire a different look. Let's just leave it with that metaphor, right? But no, I think they exist before.
Mhm.
That's definitely do.
Yeah.
And you know, the demonology which Protestants accept, picked up from the late Middle Ages, is such that there's a very fine distinction made between supernatural, the term, and preternatural. And it's a working distinction. So only God is supernatural because he created everything. The devil being a creature and a fallen angel. The knowledge he has is the result of his age and his superior intellect. And there's a Spanish refrain in English translates it something like, the devil has all this power because he's so old and has been around for so long and can do these things. So preternatural, I like to say, and it's not, well, I'll say it anyway. This concept of the devil as being very smart and very old and capable of manipulating the natural and not having a supernatural power sounds a lot like he's a great scientist who actually understands the way that things can be manipulated without actually and knows how to get inside people's heads too. But the two terms do acquire a very different value and meaning in the 16th and 17th century.
Good. Well, I think our time is up. Could we give a round of applause to our speakers? So, and please allow me to say a quick word before we break. Join us Sunday morning, December 7th at the Harvard Catholic Center for a workshop on Handel's Messiah. The distinguished musicologist Michael Morrison will dive into both the text and the music, bringing out surprising dimensions of this beloved composition, which is such an important part of Advent and Christmas. 10 a.m. to noon, followed by lunch. Check out harvardcatholicforum.org for details and registration. And again, please help us by filling out the 2-minute survey, which in-person registrants will get by email. And for our Zoom viewers, do the quick survey that comes right after this is over. And everyone here in the hall, please come with us to Di Giovanni Hall in the building next to St. Paul's Church. The building's known as the Harvard Catholic Center or the Parish Center. Join us for food and drink and conversation. The questions that we didn't get to go through here, you can raise there. It's just across Massachusetts Avenue, down Bow Street. Di Giovanni Hall is on the far side of the building on the ground floor, or just go along with others who are going on from here, and you'll be there in 5 minutes. Thank you all, and have a good evening.